Okay, this is where the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquities ends, and the rest of the Western mystery tradition goes and takes off. Most people think of the Western mystery tradition as something that's connected with Europe, but it's not. It goes very far back into antiquity. In the classes on the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity, there are still a couple of modules I haven't put in, and when I get them done, I will notify you and give you the passwords, those of you that have taken it before, and you'll be able to do that. There are a couple of places that maybe you might be missing. This mysterious bunch of symbolism on the front will become more apparent what it's all about by the time we're through the course. So the way we're going to go about business here, university survey courses on things like this are originally chronological. You do I used to teach the ancient Western mystery tradition, medieval, which is the Grail traditions or the Grail traditions, and the modern. And we're following somewhat that order. But Western mystery traditions, ancient, I expanded into initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity, which is a separate seminar that has right now, I think, 6 modules, and it's probably going to have about 8. And you have to understand these things in order to understand the Western mystery tradition. So it requires more detail. There is a natural chronological order for presentation that we'll follow, although sometimes we'll go back and pick up strands. So the transmission development of medieval and modern European Western mystery tradition happens over lots of lineages and cultural areas that are both Western and Middle Eastern and Eastern. And there's a chronological order in each that overlaps and enriches the others. And each really requires its own seminar, which I'm not doing. We're doing a survey here. So this presentation is just a survey, but we're going to have little excursions that go on chronological things. We'll be coming back and starting another strand moving forward. We will have separate seminars which are either already available or will be made available for specific streams of the Western mystery tradition, such as Mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, which I have at this point not yet put up. Early Christian mysticism. We do have the seminar on Gnosticism up now, Gnosticism, Ancient and Modern, and it has a lot of material that we don't have in this seminar. And I want to do a much more detailed seminar on the Hermetic Renaissance and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, but we cover that in one module here. Alchemy, theurgy, theosophy, and spiritualism, we touch on these things, but they deserve a lot more than we can give them in a survey. So this is a survey course, and to introduce you to all these things, and we use this as your basic introduction to the Western mystery tradition, because in our degree program what we want you to have is core courses. There's a very basic understanding of what all this is and has been, and what underlies, for example, what underlies the Templar traditions that we've revived, and other things like that. So we're going to look at the ancient roots. We talked about ancient shamanic traditions and Egyptian and Babylonian traditions in the other seminar, the Osirian, the Isian. We talked about the oracular mysteries of Delphi and Trophonius, and the Cretan Minoan, and the chthonic mystery traditions, that is, where heaven was below the earth and not above the earth. The Eleusinian, Pythagorean Pholarchi, who took people on journeys into the earth to go to the divine worlds. We talked about mysteries of Asian Minor, the ecstatic mysteries, the Dionysian cults, and so on, and the Magna Mater. We talk about the Hellenistic initiatic mysteries. We talked about the Pompeii Mystery House, I believe already we have that done in the initiatic mysteries, and Mithraism, and Mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. These are some of the things we need to I'm going to add some segments to on the initiatic mystery tradition that will be available soon. And Jewish and Christian mysteries, which most of which for the Jewish stuff you can get in the Yeshua seminar, and there are other things, Christian and Christian Gnostic things, that we have covered other places. But people like the Essenes and the Therapeutai and the Gnostic churches and so on And so there are some of that is in the Gnosticism seminar. So the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity is really the way to get that background, that root of the Western mystery tradition. Now, what do you think this is that we're looking at? What does it look like to you? It's underground, right?
Kind of a tomb or ritual.
Okay. It's actually a catacomb. There's a lot of volcanic activity in Italy and places like that, in Rome and so on. And so there are caves underground. People use them to hide in. They use them to build sanctuaries. And the underground was still considered to be sacred. Below the earth was sacred in those days. I want you to look at a couple things. Christianity has a virgin birth and a Savior that preaches and dies and is resurrected, and it has a baptism, and it has a communion of bread and wine. This is a Mithraic catacomb. It's not Christianity. It's not Christian. It was became Christian in the 4th century and 11th century. A church was erected on the spot. But what you're looking at is a Mithraic catacomb, a Mithraic sanctuary. This little carving in here is a carving of Mithra slaying the bull. Mithraism is a religion that Gentile Christians took a great deal from, because it was the Mithraic mysteries and the Isean mysteries were the dominant forms of religion that everybody knew and understood. And so a lot of that stuff got taken over into Christianity as the Gentile Christians built their understanding of it. This is what that carving looks like if you look at it up close and take a rubbing of it, etc. That's Mithra slaying the bull, and it's really a creation story. The bull is flayed and he's turned into the firmament which makes the heavens and the earth and so on. So Mithraism was the religion of the Roman soldiers and many people, and it was the root of the religious aspect of chivalry that became so important in the Middle Ages and the Grail traditions. These traditions linked battle and defending the homeland to one's gods. And so the idea of this as a kind of a secular religion outside of the church, in fact, by the medieval period, the people who could make chivalric orders were the noble people who were kind of in competition for secular power with the Pope and other people who wanted to have power. They had their own kind of religion. This was alternative religion. It was done through chivalric orders. And the stories and legends that we'll see later emerging of the Holy Grail and the quest of the Holy Grail and so on are based on the same kind of impulses that go back to the Roman knights. The knightly orders trace their lineages back to the Roman knights. And the religion of that was Mithraic, and then it became Christian. This is an image of the Grand Master of the Templars, who was captured on Black Friday, Friday the 13th. That's when we got Friday the 13th. And his name was Jacques de Molay, and he refused to knuckle under, and finally they burned him. And there's a long story about the Templars we'll be learning later. So how did the Grail traditions develop? And the word Grail really comes from a Germanic, a Teutonic word, Graal. The word Graal does not mean cup or chalice or cauldron. It means a progression from one thing to another. It was connected to a feeding of people, like we have a progressive feeding, a progressive dinner at the yacht club. But that's as close as Grail gets to feeding people. As we said, the Christian mysteries and a lot of the gnosis are derived from Mithraic forms and Isean forms of temple priesthood and worship. That there were produced in Gaul and the Celtic regions churches that were Gnostic in their orientation and that were Arian. And we'll be talking more about Arius. And they perpetuated Druidic tradition with Arian Christian mysticism and Hellenistic mystery traditions that came in through the Greco-Roman source, because there was a lot of colonization and people came from Rome into these places. And so that's where all this got kind of synthesized into what we call the Grail tradition. There was also Johannite monastic mysticism. The Johannite church was kind of the anti-church to the Byzantine state church, but the Byzantine state church couldn't rub it out because everybody knew it was founded by the Apostle John and Mary Magdalene, and it was very powerful. It was kind of a home church, and it didn't have the power of the state behind it, but the state was not able to really rub it out, and so it just persisted. And it was through the Johannite churches in Asia Minor and in the Byzantine era that a revival of Christian or of ascetic mysticism came by people who went out to the Egyptian desert to go away from civilization and to be able to grow themselves as spiritual beings. And this resulted in the tradition of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. Christian monasticism, I have to come back and spell these things right. If anybody takes a note, that would be helpful. And
The monastic.
yeah, and so people were actually 4th, 5th century young people, 18, 19, were going and making little expeditions to Egypt to go visit the famous hermits and the famous saints. Hermit is just from the word Aramite, which means desert dweller, and Greek form. And eventually hermits got themselves organized into monasteries, and the monastic movement began. And that was a wholly separate movement from the state that had become the church, called the Byzantine Church, and after Rome collapsed. Then there were the Freemasons of Lake Como. After the collapse of Rome, 4th century, and the invasion of it by the different Gothic tribes, Rome was... the Romans were pretty much driven out, and they went to Constantinople, and they went to other places in the empire. The city was taken over by the Goths for a while, and finally they left. And when they did, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Gregory the Great, he's called, organized all of his monks, and they repaired all the aqueducts, and they put the city back together, and it became the Pope's city. The Pope simply meant Papa. It was a term that was just used, came into use in the 5th, 6th century. And it remained in the possession of the church politically until the Italian reunification, and people like Garibaldi in the 1800s, 19th century, finally took it back, and now it just is shrunk down to what's called Vatican City. But the Freemasons left Rome. The people who built all those big buildings and had generations of tradition that had been handed down from father to son, and had guild initiation and guild religious ideas and things that people were initiated into in different degrees they went into, they left Rome, and they went up into the mountains high above Rome to a place called Lake Como. And they carried on the initiatic guild traditions, and they were hired by Christian and Muslim rulers to build churches and mosques. And so the same people that built the cathedrals for the Christians built the mosques for the for the Arabs, and that's why they're called Freemasons, because when you were a master, you could go anywhere without being arrested, because you were a highly desired person. And so a Freemason could go from country to country without getting arrested and getting in trouble, whereas no other occupation could do that. So the Roman architectural tradition was brought forward into medieval cathedrals and mosques and things like that. We're going to talk a little bit more about them, but there was a lot of doubt about the historicity of this Lake Como community in the 19th century, when rational scholarship first came to Freemasonry. But since then, it's been really clearly shown that this community existed, and that's where the tradition was mostly preserved. Then there were the Arabic alchemists. They had taken over in the 6th century the city of Panopolis, which we today call Akhmim, and it was there that the people who preserved the ancient Pythagorean and pagan traditions, so-called, that alchemical traditions and so on, had been driven by the Christians. They had been driven way up the river to get away from the Christians, who had murdered and slaughtered great philosophers and things like that in Alexandria and burned the library and whatever. And so they took all their library and everybody up there to Akhmim, and they carried on there for a couple of centuries, and then the Islamic invaders came, and they were absolutely enthralled with all this stuff, and of course the Christian church thought it was all pagan, evil, devil worship stuff, and the Muslims thought it was the gift of God, so they took it, and that's what really enriched Muslim culture. And Arabic astrology and alchemy and so on developed at that point, and it came really back from the Arabs into Europe much later. And then there was Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism, which was actually began and is rooted in Greek Kabbalah, which is Pythagorean, and Neoplatonic numerology, as all the best Jewish scholars will readily tell you, like Gershom Scholem and so on. And that tradition was carried on through Jewish families and communities. And finally, the great civilization that developed in Spain, in early medieval Spain, which was a place where Jews and Christians and Arabs all lived together very fruitfully in a very high culture, probably the highest kind of culture that had developed in the medieval period, and all their traditions were passed on to each other. That is one of the great places where those traditions were synthesized. And one of the great Kabbalistic Masons, the founder of Martinezism, and then very later on Martinism, what we'll talk about much later, was a Spanish Jew that came from families that had been there for 1,000 years. And then out of Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism came Christian Kabbalah, which I spell with a C. Usually we spell it with a C-A-B-A-L-A rather than the Jewish spelling, because it's different. And that became very important in the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. So there's that stream. These are all what we call Grail traditions, Grail traditions. And then there was the whole business of the so-called gypsies, who were from India. And they migrated over in the 9th century. We have some interesting stories about them. They were protected by the Scottish Templars, but they were persecuted and run all over Europe, just about everywhere else except in Bohemia, where they first came. Everybody thought they were Egyptians, because they were so mysterious and they had such secret knowledge and they could read palms and do things like that. Not recognizing that this was Vedic understanding and Vedic knowledge, people thought they were all Egyptians, because that's what they thought it was, so they called them gypsies, and the gypsies were just happy to be called gypsies, because it kind of protected them, it gave them a little status. The Knights Templar were a very important force, and we don't know exactly what they did and how they did it. We have a lot of circumstantial evidence. It's very clear that it was they who brought the Shroud of Turin into the West. They picked it up in Constantinople in a raid when they were fighting the Muslims who had captured the Christian relics, 11th and 1100s. They had originally started out as 9 French knights who were going to protect pilgrims on the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. And they were, probably rather naive at that point, but when they got into the East and they started meeting all these Muslims and people like this, they started learning from them and instead of fighting them and all that kind of stuff. And then they met other people in the East, and they met the Johannites, Johannite Greek Christians, and all kinds of different things. They were eventually initiated into what were surviving of the Hellenistic mysteries and the Johannite apostolic succession, and they were the ones that probably brought the first Arabic manuscripts translated from the Greek and Latin of the classical period, and they also were in possession of the Mandylion, which we now know as the Shroud of Turin. And then we have to talk about the Gnostic traditions of the Manichaeans and the Cathars. Mani was a great prophet of the 3rd century, 4th century, who established, in place of the declining Zoroastrianism in the Persian area and so on, a form of religion we call Manichaeism. which is very ascetic, very Gnostic. It's what we call negative Gnosis. And it has communities, it values asceticism, it makes big distinctions between different kinds of people. You can learn a lot more in the Gnosticism seminar, but it survives all the way up into the medieval period as Cathar communities, or the Albigensian communities, that eventually are very important in southern France. By that time, they've amalgamated a lot of other things themselves. The Bogomils and the troubadours. The troubadours sang songs that were influenced by these ideas, which were heretical. They were not in line with Catholic theology. And then there was the development of Protestant mysticism, probably because of von Hohenstaufen, the person who became the Holy Roman Emperor in succession to Constantine in the area that we today call Germany, who fought against papal troops in the papal states and would not allow that part of the world to become a papal state, and ruled by the Pope and ruled by the Pope's rules, and became a great friend with the Islamic chivalric orders, and was the host to and the patron of great alchemists and different people. He actually invented the first submarine. He was a brilliant, brilliant human being. Because he did that, that area was left a place where people like Martin Luther could flee to be protected by some of the dukes and people in those areas from the Pope's forces. And that's where a lot of women became very, very strong, and anti-churches or underground churches or antagonistic churches, even with their own female popes, developed in those areas of Protestant mysticism, and eventually they were persecuted, and they were the subject of the Inquisition, etc. Protestantism came out of the prosecutions of the Inquisition. And then the Hermetic Renaissance, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which happened when Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum for Cosimo de' Medici, who was dying and would rather see that than anything else that he had. He had manuscripts of Plato and all kinds of things, but Hermes was considered to be the great adept. And those very quickly, a printing press had just been developed by Gutenberg, so you could very quickly print a lot of things, and that went all over Europe and every place. And boom, we had what we call the Hermetic Renaissance. Even lots of Jesuits and people that would prefer that Catholic theology were Hermetic, etc. And then eventually out of that, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which we'll talk about later. All of these are things that develop from these traditions. So let's talk about early Christian heterodoxy. This is just a little thing I've given to show you how varied and different all the early Christian churches were, and all the lineages of what came not only from Christianity but from Judaism about the time of Jesus, and the Gnostic traditions that developed and so on. If you are looking at this online, you can kind of trace some of these lines down and see how they influenced each other and how the Gnostics were related to other forms of churches. You can never talk about the Christian church. You have to talk about the Christian church because there were so many different ones with so many different ideas, so many different so-called Bibles, and a lot of things that just go out of existence. For example, the Jerusalem church stops existing about AD 135. The Zealots stop existing about that time. That's when the War of Bar Kokhba finally completely wipes out all Jewish resistance, and Jews are cast out forever from Jerusalem and so on. And previously to that, the Sadducees became extinct and so on. So you can take a look at this and see some interesting things. Before the time of Constantine, who forever changed the world by his religious stuff, there was many kinds of Christian knowledge, gnosis. In Palestine, we had Messianic Judaism. We had the Ebionites, the poor people who were Jewish Christians who believed in poverty and tried to imitate Jesus. In Asia Minor, we had the Johannine tradition, the Johannine churches, because Mary Magdalene and very much younger John had gone to Asia Minor to spread the gospel and established churches. We had Ignatius of Antioch. We had the Johannite churches forming in Asia Minor. They all had different theologies, different ideas. There was no such thing really as theology and creeds. There were just different ways that people understood what Christianity was. In Rome, we had Marcion and Ptolemaeus, and the first bishop of Rome who really put his foot down and said, no, the rulers of the church are the successors of the apostles, was Bishop Clement. And we have the letters of Clement of Rome, which are earlier than a lot of other documents in the New Testament, as well as the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. They're not included in the New Testament, but they're included in the Apostolic Fathers and things like that. Very interesting to read about the controversies going on in the churches. In Alexandria, we have Basilides and his son Isidore, and Pantanius, who was a great teacher who had gone to India and studied in India. Valentinus, who basically originated the Valentinian system of gnosis. Clement of Alexandria, who gives us tremendous information about these things, and Origen and Arius, whose students basically evangelized the Gauls and the Celts. And a lot of this is covered in the seminar on Gnosticism. And in India, we had the Apostle Thomas, who went to India and established teachings that are very ascetic and very copacetic with a lot of Buddhist teachings. And for that reason, they stuck. And Thomas was an ascetic, and he preached against marriage and sex and things like that. And he had his own understanding of these things. So Thomas is very interesting because the Gospel of Thomas, which is in Coptic, is a Coptic translation of apparently Aramaic. And it's as early, the earliest thing we have from the New Testament is the document that underlay it, which we call the Q document, which is where we got a lot of the teachings. It was a document that just had teachings of Jesus that had been written down by people, and then that was used as a basis for writing Mark's Gospel, and then or rather for writing Matthew and Luke along with Mark's Gospel. And but we find that Thomas is a collection of is the closest thing we can get to that Q document, and it's very, very early. However, it's been what we call Gnosticized. It's had that spin put on it that is Gnostic, so there's a lot of Gnostic terminology in it. But Thomas also, people used to minimize the Thomas traditions. They said, first Christians really were the Nestorians who went to India because when they were driven out of the Monophysites in the 4th century and so on. And that's not true. If you go to the founding church of St. Thomas in India, there are inscriptions about his coming, and they're inscribed in a form of Hindi that stopped being spoken after about the end of the 1st century. And so we have a pretty good idea Thomas really did go to India and establish the churches there. Did you want to say something?
Wasn't there also a tomb?
Yes, there is a tomb of Thomas, and you can go to the church in India that has Thomas's tomb and things like that. And you can read all the stories about Thomas, and you really won't like what he has to say. It's pretty ascetic. This is, in fact, what the modern tomb of Thomas looks like now. And that's from inside the sanctuary, so this is a picture of that. This is what it looks like from the outside on a good day. So Thomas's teachings did go very early. They were synthesized and very much syncretized with ascetic Buddhist teachings of the time, which we call Hinayana teachings, or the older Buddhist teachings, just as Christian teachings in Europe were synthesized with Druidic teachings and things like that. So there are different traditions of apostles, the apostolic traditions that go through the Orthodox churches in the East, and there are Gnostic traditions and there are initiatic traditions. In Egypt, in Alexandria, we had the Apostolic Gnosis that we call that from the 1st to 5th century. The disciple of Peter was named Mark, and he wrote what we call the Gospel of Mark, based on what Peter had taught him. It was written in Greek. But he also wrote a secret Gospel of Mark, which is written for those who are being perfected. And we don't have the whole thing, but we have some parts of it because of Clement of Alexandria, a letter of his quoting it, and it was hidden and not information that was supposed to be available to people. We find also from the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library in Egypt, we find some very interesting documents that were used by early Christians. From the 3rd century onward, Egypt became Orthodox. It fell under the what we call the proto-Orthodox people, especially Athanasius, who was a bishop, and the Nicene Creed eventually developed, etc. And there was persecution of the earlier Christian traditions, Gnostic traditions, and things like this. And the Coptic Church itself was formed at that time, and it was really a native, separate church that was not part of the Byzantine Church. And it existed outside of the Byzantine Church and kept its own traditions. And probably it's out of those traditions that the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library comes. In Asia Minor and Syria, the Apostolic Gnosis, well, there was an initiatic apostolic gnosis. We can see that by studying the Gospel of Mary and learning some things about Mary Magdalene, and Secret Gospel of Mark shows us Jesus initiating people in a certain kind of way, one-to-one, like you do in a Hermetic initiation. And so there's clandestine initiation of some sort that is carried on probably by the churches started by Mary Magdalene and John, the Johannite churches as they're known. And that kind of thing was transmitted in the 12th century to the Knights Templar, but it was clandestine. There were also pre-Orthodox churches. There were several early apostolic lines that spread from the city of Edessa. They're called the Church of the East, and today it survives as the Nestorian Church, the Persian Church, the East Syrian Church, the Chaldean Syrian Church in India only, the Holy Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church of the East, and the Assyrian Church of the East, all of which provide separate lines of succession through history. They're not part of the Catholic Church, and they're not part of the Greek Orthodox Church. And their lines of succession are some of the lines of succession that we pass on down because we have all of them. From the 3rd century onward, Asia Minor becomes Orthodox. It becomes Eastern Orthodox. The Byzantine State Church kind of rules with Nicene Christianity, and Eastern Orthodoxy then splits off from Roman Catholicism about the 8th century, and then we have the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman churches. The Eastern Orthodox churches are celebrating Easter on a different time scale, usually a month later than the Roman Catholic Church does. So when in this country they say it's Easter in April, usually you'll get Eastern Orthodox Easter in May. It's around the time of Wesak. In Europe, there were some kind of initiatic traditions, possibly from the 1st to the 3rd centuries, maybe up to the 10th at the time of the Carolingian Reformation. There was Celtic Druidic Christianity in the British Isles and among the early people who had become the French and German. And it was established by the Arian missionaries during the 4th century Merovingian dynasty. When the Merovingian dynasty developed in the 4th century, that was the church. It was the Arian Celtic Christian churches, and they were protected by the dynasty.
What does Arian mean?
Arian is from a fellow named Arius. Arius was a bishop who was condemned in the Nicene Council, the Council of Nicaea, because he taught a theology in which Jesus was human and he became divine, and all people could do the same.
So is this?
Pardon?
So it's why we do this?
Well, no, that's the Monophysite tradition, which is another thing, but that was part of the thing too. But he was teaching some things that were much closer to probably the original Messianic understandings of people about why Jesus taught a religion of becoming perfect, becoming initiated, and so on. Catholic Christianity began its incursions into Celtic Christianity during the development of Europe, and there were some rulers of Europe that became Catholic, Roman Catholicism made its incursions into the city of Lyon in the 2nd century onward. There were families there that were Catholic, Roman Catholic. And in Germany and France from the 10th century onward, they were all Catholic. They have become Catholicized. The British Isles were invaded during the Norman conquest and converted over to, forced into Roman Catholicism. That's what happened to all the native religions in Europe, native Christians religions. In Persia and India and China, there was what we call the negative Gnostic asceticism, very typical of what Thomas had brought over. A lot of affinities with Hindu and Buddhist asceticism. Then later, about 4th century, the Nestorians, driven out by the Monophysite controversy about issues like whether there were two natures of Christ or one nature, which really means do I have anything in common with Christ, or am I just an off-scouring piece of crap and he's a tin god up in the sky? And according to the Catholics, he's a tin god up in the sky, but he has a little of your nature, but all you have is the crud, and you can't become anything like that. And so there are other people that held to the other view that that there was one nature of God and Christ and humanity, and they were Nestorians and Monophysites. Monophysite means one nature. So there's quite a history of these Nestorian churches: the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, the Persian Church, the East Syrian Church, the Chaldean Syrian Church in India only, and the Holy Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church of the East, and the Assyrian Church of the East, and a lot of which still remain, and we also pass on their lines of succession. They were brought together before us by earlier bishops, and as the lines of succession were brought together and reunified in the last 2 centuries. In Palestine, there were the Ebionites, the Jewish Christians that had their own apostolic traditions. There is a Gospel of Matthew that is Hebrew form of a Gospel of Matthew. It's not just a Hebrew translation of the Greek Gospel of Matthew. It's one that was actually kept in Jewish families and finally discovered by a bishop in the medieval period a few centuries ago, and which you can get a copy of if you wish. There were many Gnostic movements in the Middle East. They were ascetic, anti-feministic. They were ruled by an elite. It was what we call the negative form of Gnostic tradition. And then if you take this seminar, you can learn a lot more about this stuff, the seminar on Gnosticism. There were the Mandeans. And the Mandeans were those who still survive today, although they haven't really got a real good handle on preserving their ancient traditions. It's mostly oral. There's a big community in Los Angeles. They've been persecuted in various Islamic countries. A lot of them are still held up in Palestine trying to get, or in Lebanon trying to come over to the United States. Mandeans who considered John the Baptist to be the Messiah. And their Mandean Gnosis and Mandean Gnosticism is a form of Jewish Gnosticism that's not too far away from a lot of the Kabbalistic ideas that Jesus shared. Here's a picture taken of a Mandean woman reciting some prayers, etc. They were Messianic. John the Baptist was considered by most of them to be the coming of the true Messiah. It's mainly oral tradition. We don't have any ancient documents from them because a lot of them are trying to revive it and piece it together today. And there are communities that still live today, and there's probably invaluable information in them. The Manichaeans we discussed, founded by Mani. Very few of their documents remain because they were so persecuted. He was torn apart and flayed. That means the skin was peeled off and things like that.
While he was alive.
Well, their communities survived all the way up into Europe as the Bogomil communities and the Cathars, although they were somewhat changed. They were very persecuted. Don't have much in the way of their documents. As I say, it's very hard to get documents of these older persecuted groups. There were Hermetic forms of initiation and gnosis. Initiation is like a death one goes through. The Egyptian mysteries carried on initiation into priesthood through a death and raising back to life, just as you find in the Masonic raising of a master. The guide at death, the beings that guided you through death were underground beings, chthonic beings. And when they guided you through initiation, they wore the masks of these deities that would come for you at death. And there are also Greek underground mysteries, and the initiation involved the imitation or going through a death underground. The guide was Hermes. Now Hermes is a Greek god, but in Egyptian tradition later, Hellenistic tradition, he becomes assimilated with Thoth, Hermes Thoth, and becomes what we call Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. He's a revealer of the mysteries that one can learn only after death or from the fallen angels and so on. There is a Hellenistic synthesis that brings us all together, and so we come to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. Clement of Alexandria tells us about the Hermetic, how the Egyptian priesthood had become formed into a Hermetic kind of fraternity, and how during the time of the coronation of a new pharaoh, that the priests who were in charge of the books of all the knowledge of the Egyptians would come in carrying these books on astrology, on alchemy, and all kinds of other things. And their patron deity was Thoth, who became associated in the Hellenistic synthesis with Hermes. And then as the Egyptian empire decayed and became no empire anymore, the priesthood carried on in its own ways with its own rituals and initiations, and we had the sect of Hermes Trismegistus. And that was a very important part of the Western mystery tradition, because Hermes is really the magus par excellence of the Western mystery tradition, Hermes Trismegistus. Here we have a picture of Hermes inscribed on a cathedral floor in Siena in the 12th century. In which he is handing to Moses the secret knowledge of heaven. And he kind of has the same kind of relationship to Moses in these traditions as Melchizedek had to Abraham, as he was the high priest of God. And here we have a medieval representation of Hermes guiding and helping the Hermetic philosopher and the Hermetic alchemist. And representing then, holding the caduceus of Hermes, which represents not just knowledge, but knowledge that can be exercised with power in the physical world, and the knowledge of astrology, the globe, and all this sort of thing. This is the representation of Hermetic initiation.
Medicine and astrology.
Include medicine and astrology. In order to become initiated in the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, you had to study many, many years. And there were Hermetic preachers or teachers that would go out on the street, and they would talk to people and tell them to abandon their ignorance and blah, blah, blah. And then people would come and they would listen to the person, and they would take the first lessons. People who went beyond that would go into smaller groups of maybe 8 and be taught more advanced things, and then other people in groups of 3. Finally, when you were really through all those many years of study, it was a one-to-one initiation. And I translated the Hermetic initiation tractate from Nag Hammadi and when I was in graduate school. So what they study, they had to become experts in astrology, because they had to understand the currents and forces that were operating in this world ruled by Hymarmene, by fate, by the forces exerted by greater things like the planets and the planetary motions, etc. They had to study mathematics. They had to become quite good at mathematics because that was applied to astrology and to other things, and architecture. They studied philosophy. They studied alchemy. They studied healing, medicine, medical arts, and the arts of divination, what we call oracular gnosis, the arts of divining things. And then they did their final studies with a Hermetic father, who was called a Hermes. And they, through the use of their voice and energy, and powerful harmonic sounds, they achieved the vision of the Ogdoad. The Ogdoad was the eighth heaven where the Hermetic saints abided, and they guided those of us on earth telepathically. They were the model of what would later be the Christian saints, who you could pray to, and St. Anthony would help you find your pennies and things like that, you know. But they were up there, and you would become, part of you would now be dwelling with them while you were also in flesh. We have a seminar on harmonic intoning that relates to this. And we will have a seminar on the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. This is the popular translation I did for people of my doctoral dissertation on the initiation discourse of Hermes Trismegistus found at Nag Hammadi. I also have my full dissertation, I think, online as well for people that are scholars and so on. Now, a great adept who was a, quote, pagan, but he was a Pythagorean adept who was reviving the deep pagan mysteries about the middle of the 1st century, just not long after the crucifixion of Jesus, revived the Pythagorean mysteries, and he did what Pythagoras had supposedly done, traveled to India. He kept silence for 5 years as part of his initiation, etc. You can read Philostratus's Apollonius of Tyana, which is a wonderful book to read because it was written in the 1st century or 2nd century actually. He was like Jesus. He was an exorcist. He performed all kinds of miracles, all the kinds of things. He was what the scholars call a theos aner, a divine man. And he was to the Grail tradition what Jesus was to the Christian tradition. However, he was not considered to be a god or the only one or something like that. He was considered to be a model for what other people could be. And so Apollonius of Tyana probably was the orientation out of which the deeper mystics came when they came to Christianity. So when they looked at Jesus, instead of looking at him as a god who came out of heaven and went back up to heaven like the Gentiles had, they looked at him more as a great master who achieved apotheosis. So that was all wrapped up and folded into the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus and the Trismegistic theurgical mysteries, the way that people would develop. Now, this was another kind of gnosis. We call this positive gnosis. Different than the Gnosticism that you find, the Valentinian gnosis, and the Gnosticism you find associated with the traditions of Thomas and things like this. These are not ascetic traditions. In fact, there's a very high valuation of having children and relations between men and women, and of females. In fact, many females are initiated. Some of the greatest masters are female, like Miriam the alchemist, who is the great master of all the alchemists in Alexandria and so on. But, very sadly, the traditions are wiped out. They're slowly scrunched out by the Christian ascetic traditions, which are like the Gnostic traditions in that they're very negative. And there's a very interesting tractate from the that we can translate from the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library. It's a prophecy about the coming of this world, of a world in which all the great mysteries are going to be scrubbed out and stomped out, and what's going to triumph is this very negative thing that's all these opposite things. In other words, it's very prophetic. And then it says, but a time will come much later after this, when the true mysteries will be made known again and will come back into the world. So there are many versions you can get of this.
So that's available, huh?
GRS Mead, yeah, all this. So the one I showed you first has the Greek on one page and the English on the other. It's a scholar's edition, but this is just a good translation by GRS Mead of Apollonius of Tyana. Now, after Constantine had established his empire, and after the Nicene Creed was established and all that, a ruler came in called Julian the Apostate. This was within just a couple of emperors after Constantine, who had turned it into a Christian empire where everybody had the same Bible, everybody had the same theology and everything. And Julian wanted to turn it back over to the true old mysteries. And so he tried to revive that. You could read about Julian the Apostate and what he did and what he tried to do and how hated he was by the Christians. And he lasted his whole thing lasted about one thing, and then he was gone. He was probably something like the Egyptian pharaoh who lasted, tried to make some big changes and married a commoner and did a bunch of things like that. And the priests wiped him out after, maybe even poisoned him, we don't know. But so this is something about the conflicts that were going on between the religions and the mysteries at the third, fourth. In the Pythagorean mysteries, silence is very important. You keep silence about what you've learned and what you've been initiated into, and you actually are initiated by being silent, by not talking for a period of 5 years. This is the original initiation. You can learn a lot from just being silent. The first tractate of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is called the Poimandres, is about finding the wealth and the richness in silence and meditation. So these are meditative kinds of traditions. These are representations of the way astrology had made its way into all the mysteries at this time. It was now integrated into the cosmology of everything. This is most of the Gnostic systems understood the world in terms of its relationship to the planets that went around it and the spheres and so on. In Alexandria, which is right on the Mediterranean Sea at the end of the Nile River, we had the development of probably the greatest flowering of esoteric knowledge, including all the Pythagorean and Hermetic and everything else, that was part of the great library at Alexandria. And also, this is a little map I've drawn, but near the royal palace at the Great Harbor was where the library was. It's been being revived, by the way, by the new Egyptian government. They're building a new library of Alexandria, which is very interesting to look at. In this area, this was the Jewish sector, huge Jewish population. There was a lot of Jewish esoteric stuff going on there. One of the most important were the healers that lived in a community down a little south of that, near a lake, which they were called the Therapeutae. And I postulate in my book that I've written about the life of Jesus that he spent some time with the Therapeutae to learn some of his healing skills. This is where probably the Library of Alexandria was. The Therapeutae lived at Lake Mareotis, which was a little south of this canal. Well, some of the great Alexandrian adepts who were involved in the Grail traditions were people like Cleopatra. Not talking about Queen Cleopatra. That's very different. Hero of Alexandria, who designed the first steam engines and was a scientist and designed temples that would, where when the door opened up, fire would come out of the mouth of the god and consume the sacrifices, and the god would actually move mechanically. Because a deity, a sculptor, a Greek sculptor, was the person who could make the best, most perfect and beautiful image of a god, but then bring you closer to the god. It was idolatry. It was the way of approaching the gods is by modeling them in stone. Stone was had a very different property than wood or anything else. And those who could make the best image of a Jupiter or of a Zeus, or I should say, or of an Aphrodite, were those who had made a powerful image that could do things. Later, in the Hermetic Renaissance, the same thing is done by artists. We'll look at how artists designed their paintings in order to do the very same kind of thing. And they took it a step further in Alexandria, where they actually mechanized the statues, the idols, so they would actually move, because by getting them to move, they would have even a better imitation. You'd even be closer to the gods. They also, gods, you have to understand, people didn't think gods were things that people realized that people made gods, that gods were egregors. For example, the priests of Egypt had as their god Osiris, which is a human god, a anthropomorphic god. Very often the early Egyptian gods became, they were a combination of animals and humans. They were zoomorphic. They were animal-shaped. Osiris was a totally human-shaped god. It was a rather late development. But when later the ruling Ptolemies incorporated a very large area where the god of that area was Apis, the bull, then the priests were brought together to create a new god that would represent both areas, and he was called Serapis. It was Osiris and Apis. Osirapis became Serapis, and he was made out of black granite because of the black land of Egypt. Keme means the black land, the black soil that comes up from the Nile. And he was in the Serapeum, and the Serapeum became the temple of Isis, the temple that spread all over the Mediterranean. We still had them in the medieval period. When people started making tarot cards, they used a lot of the images they found on the Serapeum temples, some of which were half submerged underwater in Italy and places. And Hero of Alexandria was the person who designed machines to run the gods. So I just want to give you an idea what a god is. A god is not quite as separate from human beings as we might think, and as people might think. It's something that humans actually create. Cleopatra of Alexandria was a great alchemist. She was a woman. These are some of the diagrams that have come down to us of the equipment that she made as an alchemist. In the western area of Alexandria is where a lot of this developed, not too far from the Jewish sector. And this is probably where the Library of Alexandria was, where all the great documents about all the knowledge that really existed in the ancient world was kept. And that knowledge was considered by the Christians to be impious knowledge. It had come from the fallen angels, and all of this kind of work was stuff that was considered to be inspired by demons. The Library of Alexandria was, without question, the greatest repository of knowledge that had ever existed in the ancient world. And it was totally interfaith. I mean, it had all kinds of stuff from all kinds of different religions and things, and it had philosophers, scientists, all kinds of information, and it was available to people who would use it. So Alexandria became a place in the 2nd century, 3rd century, where some of the most sophisticated ideas about God and man and cosmos could be formed. From Plato and through the Hermetic tradition and into the Neoplatonists, Plotinus, and a lot of the Christian mystics, the ideas of two worlds, a sensible world, which you call a mundane world, which would include the visible cosmos, the matter, the earth, the 7 planets, and the fixed stars, was connected to an invisible universe, the super-mundane cosmos, or the super-sensible cosmos, where the world soul dwelt, and the gods and the forms of mind, and then the one of all things dwelt. And that's what the goal was of Neoplatonistic contemplation, etc. And so these ideas developed in the context of Alexandria. Plato's ideas we find in the Hermetic. Plato's Timaeus tells us ideas about the world soul and all this sort of thing, and that is a conversation that happened supposedly between Socrates and an Egyptian priest named Timaeus, and Timaeus tells him this whole story of how the world formed and all this sort of thing. The story is later retold, we found in a Hermetic document called the Kore Cosmo, which means the maiden, virgin, or mother of the world. So these two divisions between the mundane and the super-mundane, or the sensible world and the super-sensible world, were clearly understood. So the stars and the planets in the sky and all that sort of thing were visible representations of an invisible and divine grace that existed in the world. You still find that if you go to an Episcopal church and you take communion, he will tell you that it's a visible manifestation of an invisible grace, and so on. And out of that developed the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, that as things are above, so they are below, and as they are below, so they are above. And that means that that human beings are connected by a hierarchy to the very highest of all realities, and that we can aspire to that rather than just being poor little dummies that run around and don't know anything. That was Hermetic philosophy. Now, alchemy also began in the ancient world in India and in China, and we don't have a lot of recordings of exactly how it began and what it was done for. We just know it was being done. There hasn't been as much historical research into these things. It's starting to develop now. Here are some, can you read us the Sanskrit to that here? You're getting pretty good at Sanskrit. I don't know if you can read it. This is an alchemical apparatus developed in Hindu alchemy. Maybe you can read that one.
I don't know the combination letters yet.
Yeah.
Letters.
But this was developing not only in Egypt. Alchemy was developing at the same time in other places. The very interesting thing is astrology is developing at the same time in several places, although the root seems to be, Babylon and the Zoroastrians. But in India it develops very quickly because it's part of that whole tradition. And if you go to study ancient astrology among the Greeks, as you do through the horoscopes that I have that are from the papyruses translated by Neugebauer, and you read those, you are reading an astrology that is nothing like Western astrology. You're reading astrology that sounded just like Vedic astrology, which is the real ancient sidereal astrology. So I'm pointing out that we have astrological traditions, rather alchemical traditions going on in several parts of the world. Sanskrit. Cleopatra of Alexandria was a woman. She's very famous. We don't know a lot about her. We know that she was head of the alchemical school, but we also know that there was a Miriam the Jewess. Miriam is accredited as being the head of the Alexandrian alchemical school by Zosimus later on. So I don't know whether Cleopatra was a student of Miriam or Miriam was a student of Cleopatra, but we know that women were very much involved with cooking up all these things.
And period of time here?
This is the 1st century, 2nd century, yeah.
1st and 2nd century.
Yeah, and before that period. These are things that tell us a little bit more about Greek alchemy. We tell us what kind of things they used and therefore what kinds of things they did. They distilled things. They could make very subtle ethers. They could make Indian naphtha. the Indians had discovered this. It was a vapor that was so that very combustible and flammable, but it was so completely like much more than alcohol. It was so much more volatile than alcohol that if you just opened a little bit of it, it would immediately, you could smell it on the other side of the room. And if you brought some fire near it, the fire would just go on a streak across the room. And they did all kinds of things. They colored glass, created supposedly ever-burning lights that would burn without air in certain conditions, and all kinds of interesting things. We're looking at Greek here now, not Sanskrit. Now, the Arabs were very interested in alchemy, and they had learned a lot of it when they had come into to Panopolis in the 6th century and made contacts with all that community, that Pythagorean community there. Because after the destruction of the library at Alexandria and the persecution of the pagans, these people all moved upstream real far to get out of the clutches of the Christian churches and the Christian. We would think of them as fundamentalists. We could call them we call them proto-Orthodox Christians. And they had preserved their own versions of the much smaller libraries of all these things, and then the Arabs learned from them. And so here now we have some Arabic alchemical apparatus that you see that the writing is in Arabic. So Egyptian alchemy is from the word al, which is an Arabic word. It means the, and keme, which means Egypt, the Black Land, the Egyptian art, because the alchemy of the Arabs was learned from the Egyptian alchemists. But when they moved in on India, which they did very soon, they ran into Hindu alchemists as well. So these are some of the words and some of the concepts that the Arabic alchemists developed, and some of the symbology they developed for these things, and the words they developed for them. Miriam the Jewess is credited by Zosimus, who is the head of the Pythagorean community in Panopolis, or Akhmim, as being really the founder of Alexandrian alchemy. And she was, number one, a woman, number two, a Jew. Those are two very important things to remember. Now, in Jewish tradition, in Jewish alchemical tradition, it is said that Miriam, the wife of Moses, was the founder of alchemy for the world. However, she's called Miriam the Jewess in Alexandria, and probably that's where that legend stems from. There were many Miriams. It translates as Mary, Miriam Magdalene, and all these others.
I thought that there was a relationship, or a reference anyway, made to this Miriam as Mary Magdalene. Is that not true?
Well, yeah, I'm sure there are references made to that by people who don't know. You know, yeah. I think I read one of those references recently in some stupid internet posting. But no, this is not Mary Magdalene.
We have the book, The Jewish Alchemists, that discuss her.
Oh yeah,
school.
that's by
Raphael Patai.
Yeah, Patai, great scholar that if you want to read about the more esoteric parts of Judaism. He was rejected for a long time by Jewish rabbis who didn't like the fact that astrology and alchemy had been part of Jewish tradition, because it is now. But the little circle I just clicked that went up here, do anybody know what that represents? What are we looking at? See what a snake swallowing its own tail. That is called the Ouroboros, the tail biter. And that is a symbol from astrology that represents can represent the path of the sun and the ecliptic, and it can represent many other things. It's a Gnostic symbol as well, about that relates to the rulership of what the Greek called hymarmene, or the rulership of forces over the earth, and they're considered to be alchemical forces. They operate that way. So alchemy had to be integrated with astrology, and so alchemical processes and alchemical operations were done at certain astrological times. And I would point out here that these symbols, like for example, this is the symbol for the element, what we call the element silver, which was derived from a silver ore. These are things that survived in alchemy all the way up into the medieval period. They come from Egypt. Well, so of course, the time came when the church had to crush the pagans and burn down the Library of Alexandria, probably. That's probably what happened to it. So we're going to talk about Hypatia, or Hypatia, as some people say. Hypatia was another woman who was the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria. See, anything that has women at the head of it is in very serious trouble with the Christian Church, Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. Anything with a woman at the head of it is considered to be the work of the devil. The church basically did different things, or different things came out of the church as persecutions. Athanasius and some of the other bishops preached against the pagans and their philosophies and things like that, and incited people like Gregory the deacon to lead a mob of people and literally grab Hypatia the philosopher, pull her out of her chariot, pull her limbs apart, and kill her to pieces. And so many of the traditions were driven out into the desert or up into the monasteries and different kinds of places. This is Athanasius. Remember him. He's considered to be a great saint in the Christian Church. I've always considered him to be a real jerk myself.
And he's the one who incited people.
He's one of many, but he was one that basically was behind the outing of lots of different people. So Hypatia, as I said, was a great philosopher. She was the head of her school. This is the only, and this is a true portrait of her. She was a beautiful woman and brilliant. She was the leader of the 4th century Neoplatonic initiatic school in Alexandria. And as I said, she was a mob led by a deacon, Gregory the deacon, or someone pulled her from her chariot. This is a representation of that travesty. And that was really the beginning of what would become Christian campaigns against pagans and heretics. That's probably why we had the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic library all buried in a cave in a bunch of jars. It's because to monks they were sacred, and then they got outed by somebody. When we study the period of the Inquisition, the very same things go on. So these are the manuscripts that came from the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic library. They're called Nag Hammadi because they're by a place up the Nile called Nag Hammadi. They're written in Coptic, which is the latest form of the Egyptian language that was written with Greek characters. And then probably it was Christian zealots, anti-pagan zealots, who burned the Library of Alexandria, because a fire that had started there could have been put out very easily, but it was very wholesale burned. It was a massive job, and we don't know much about it. And of course, it's the church that preserves history about a lot of this, because they've burned all the other books. So that's all we have to know about it. Now, I'm not trying to turn you against Jesus or anything, but I'm not a real fan of the Christian church. I just want you to know.
What's that?
The Hermetic and Alchemical and Pythagorean and Neoplatonic philosophic and mystery traditions were driven up to Panopolis, which is up the Nile River, to the city we now call Akhmim. One of the dialects of Coptic is Akhmimic. High up the Nile River, and it's there that manuscripts were preserved by these people, or recopied, or delivered orally, or the ones they had were kept, and privately the private manuscripts were kept. And it's those that were discovered by the Arabs. So I want to talk a little bit about the alchemical writings of Zosimus. Now we're talking about 5th century understandings of alchemy. And so I'm going to read you a little from a 3rd century Greek adept, Zosimus of Panopolis, and give you a little flavor of what he's doing. Now I'm playing, what I'm telling you, what I'm reading you is not a fable or a dream. It's his vision of an alchemical process that he's doing. Because these people were pantheists. They believed there was life and soul in everything. Everything had life, everything had soul, everything was conscious. Just like Mother Jenny believed. Spiritualists believed, and things like this, just like Pythagoras believed. Happily your grandmother was some form of bird or something, as Shakespeare said, you know. But yes, transmigration of the soul, that all of us have soul, we all have, everything is a living thing. So when you take these elemental and elementary things and you burn them and you mix them and you dissolve them, dissolving is compared to chopping with a sword, burning is burning, and things like that, then they're going through experiences and you're experiencing what they're experiencing. So I saw a certain sacrificing priest, says Zosimus, standing before me and over an altar which had the form of bowl, cauldron, and that altar had 15 steps going up to it. That represents the processes. Then the priest stood up, and I heard from above a voice say to me, I have completed the descent of the 15 steps and the ascent of the steps of light, and it is the sacrificing priest who renews me, casting off the body's coarseness, and consecrated by necessity. That necessity means destiny. It's the relationship of the forces that are put onto the earth by the stars and the planets. And consecrated by necessity, it's done at a certain astrological time, I have become a spirit. So he has separated spirit from body here. And when I had heard the voice of him who stood in the altar formed like a bowl, I questioned him, desiring to understand who he was. He answered me in a weak voice, saying, I am Ion, priest of the adytum. The adytum is the sanctuary. And I have borne an intolerable force, for someone came at me headlong in the morning and dismembered me with a sword and tore me apart according to the rigor of harmony. That means according to a recipe. And having cut my head off with a sword, he mashed my flesh with my bones and burned them in the fire of the treatment until my body transformed. I should learn to become a spirit, and I sustained the same intolerable force. Now, so this is what an alchemist sees when he's working with a metal or with a plant or something like that. And even as he said these things to me and I forced him to speak, it was as if his eyes turned to blood and he vomited up all his flesh. And I saw him as a mutilated image of a little man, and he was tearing at his flesh and falling away, etc., etc., etc. So when we start to see the alchemical allegories in the medieval period, you will find that they're very little changed from the way they were understood a long time ago. I'm just pointing that out to you to look at these roots of these things. The other things that were taken up there were the writings of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus. Plato is a philosopher who wrote down the teachings of Socrates, who never wrote anything. Plato was a student. Aristotle was the student of Plato, who disagreed with Plato on about everything, like all students do. And Plotinus, who was the founder of the the Neoplatonic school of meditation and theurgy and so on. Iamblichus. All these were taken up to Akhmin and discovered by the Islamic conquerors. Now, Islamic civilization was far more advanced than Byzantine and any Western civilization until the European Renaissance, and based on what the Europeans took from the Arabs, who had taken it from classical culture, based on these same texts preserved by Islam and sold to the Europeans 5 or 7 centuries later, European civilization began to rise and flower, and the Renaissance began, and so on. So I'm giving you all this as a basis for understanding what the Grail tradition is and what the value of it is. So here is one of the great Arab philosophers and alchemists, Avicenna, or Avicenna, as it's pronounced sometimes.
Who called him that? Probably not the Arabs, no?
No, those were names given by the Latin-speaking scholars, or they were corruptions of Arabic names as we knew them. For example, the later Hermetic people, in the Hermetic Renaissance, would refer to as one of the first alchemists of the Arabs as Geber. And his name was not Geber, but it was something that could be mashed into that if you were trying to understand it in your own language.
And Avicenna was really into healing, right?
Yes. So here's a kind of a timeline. So before about 3000 BC, we have basically shamanic arts that are priestly arts. And in Egypt, these developed to very advanced things after about 3000 BC. And in Greece, after about 2000 BC, we start to develop the mystery cults, mystery religions, and Greek medicine, and so on. And finally, the days of Pythagoras, about 600 BC, before the Christian era. And I will use BCE for what most people call BC, before Christianity, before the Christian era, and CE, rather than AD, as after the Christian era. Pythagoras was the head of a whole bunch of what people call, rather chauvinistically, pre-Socratic philosophers who developed the tradition of science in the ancient world. And science and mysticism and spirituality were not separated by Pythagoras. They were all one thing. And they were priests and they were scientists and so on. And Pythagorean science is what really drove the military forces of the Greeks and other people, because they designed military machines that could use lever forces and mirrors and to concentrate light and do all kinds of things. They were the techno geeks of their age, the Pythagoreans, and they were sought like Masons were sought later on to build things for rich people and to protect them. But they were also feared. The Pythagorean community was literally wiped out by a bunch of scared kings at a certain time and so on, because we didn't want to have them, too many of those people all in the same place at the same time. Shamanic tradition also brings us Hebrew prophets. The Hebrew prophets were first and foremost shamans. They were amazing people. People like Elijah, who could run along with chariots for 20 miles without even drawing a breath, and even when he was 70 years old, and things like that. Amazing people who lived out in the desert and communed with God and nature. And through those traditions, we got the Kabbalistic mysticism of the Jewish Second Temple. We call it the Second Temple because the first one was destroyed in the Babylonian captivity, and then it was rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah. And during that period, after the Jews had had their contact with Babylonians and the Zoroastrians and started to develop their literature and put together their Bible and their thought, and Jewish mysticism began to develop in what we call Kabbalah, which is that which is passed down from the voice of the master to the ear of the student, but not written down. Kabbalah, Kabbalistic mysticism, that's the background out of which Jesus speaks. That's what he understood, and that is what the people who wrote the New Testament did not understand. They didn't have that background. And Pythagorean mysticism informed that. In fact, basically Kabbalah, Jewish numbers, Kabbalah, and cosmological Kabbalah, and eventually astrological influences and everything else in Jewish mysticism came mostly through Pythagorean influences of the Greeks. And these were very educated people from different traditions. Interfaith would get together and they would deal with each other's thing and learn each other's things, because when you get in that level of knowledge and skill, the barriers of culture do not separate people. So now the Pythagorean tradition, as we understand it, is brought down into Alexandria and brought into this grand Hermetic synthesis after about 200 BC. And this becomes what you have in the city of Alexandria at the time that Christianity goes into it, with St. Mark and people like that, who for the first couple of centuries are mystics who are very much influenced by all this. And later on the fundamentalists take over. Now, what happens here is an Orthodox Christian suppression after about AD 350 of the Christian era, or AD 350, and you have the school of alchemy being developed. These people go up the river after about that time, and after that, this knowledge gets passed to the Islamic conquerors in the 6th century. It's not because they came and stole it, because they did very different kind of thing. They did take over everything, but they didn't crush people and do all kinds of nasty stuff and say you're from the devil. They were interested in learning from them and looked at the beautiful things they did and so on. Well, that's kind of a timeline that we're starting with. So this becomes the basis of what we call the Hermetic sciences and leads to the development of medieval Hermetic alchemy. And that becomes totally integrated with Hermetic philosophy, and the same symbols that we had in the ancient period are still being carried forward. So what I want to show you is there is a lineage that brings us forward, and that's why we can call it the Grail tradition, or the Grail mysteries, because even though they're rediscovered and they're constantly done, as Daniel was pointing out to me, the knowledge itself grows and it continues and it's passed on. It's dug up somewhere. For example, as I've mentioned, the great Indian Navajo shaman who grew up in a world where the entire Navajo world had been destroyed in the late 1900s, Hostine Claw, and he was a kind of a strange child, being a hermaphrodite, being both male and female in his in his anatomy. As a young child, was drawn to a cave. He went in the cave and he found the shamaning instruments and a lot of other things from the ancient shamans, from not ancient, but maybe 3 generations ago. And he sat with them and he learned from them and he listened to them and he figured out things. And he began to restore the shamaning tradition of the Navajos. That's what's happened in the Western mystery tradition. It's been destroyed by the Inquisition. It's been destroyed by the Christian fundamentalists, all the kind of people. Little parts of it have been saved. Other people have grabbed it and picked it up and so on. That's how it's progressed. We don't have a straight, undamaged lineage from person to person. Very often, it's the only thing that's left is books or other kinds of artifacts, and then they're picked up and people get it. Maybe they were the same people who were killed two generations ago and they've come back. I don't know. So anyway, these traditions survive and they get all put together in the medieval period.